And Dennis, why don't you take it away? Thank you.
You know, Doug, we didn't check the NOAA climate transfer portal. You know, that's the thing in college athletics, the transfer portal. So maybe we could have gotten a climate person there. Anyway, moving on with the important things. Thanks for the introduction, Doug. Always happy to be here with you. I would say I'm probably third string on the list here, but we'll try to muddle our way through. Just a reminder again, mid-November, it's kind of an overcast day here, waiting for the cold front to pass through the area and to turn what's been recently warm temperatures a bit cooler again. Just a reminder of all the partners involved here, and that this will be recorded and available within a couple days, so you can share with partners, colleagues, whoever you want to. And that we will have one more this calendar year in December. About as late as we can do this in the year, right before Christmas. We have two new parts of coming in December. One, a new presenter, Dr. Steve Vavris, who is the Wisconsin state climatologist, relatively recently named, and also the first presenter from Wisconsin. That only leaves Wyoming now, so we need to have somebody present from Wyoming to complete all the states in our region to be able to do that. We're looking forward to having Steve, welcoming him to the partner services in the region. So as per our usual agenda, kind of review of current conditions, touch on a few impacts. You know, despite being outside the growing season, we still have some impacts going on, especially from the water side. And then we'll hand it over to Doug to close it out with the El Nino and outlook. So to kind of touch on where we have been and to show you some of the leaves that I had to take care of in my backyard, we will review from temperature standpoint in October. This is the statewide rankings for the month of October. You see most of the region was on the warm side, on the above average side, while the northern plains fell near average. But it was pointed out to us by folks at the Climate Prediction Center that these rankings would have been quite a bit different had there not been the sharp cold turn at the end of the month, with several days of extreme cold that shifted the rankings quite a bit because it was such extreme cold. We'll talk about that a bit more later. So, you know, top 30 or so warmest around the region, while near average or slightly below average up in the plains area. From a precipitation standpoint, this was really interesting and kind of caught me by surprise when I pulled this out. That the northern part of most of our region here was on the above average side in the way of precipitation, with two states, South Dakota and Wisconsin, at number 117, which would put them at the 13th wettest in the last 129 years. So this did improve situations, improve the drought situation, soil moisture. We'll touch on those as we go along. While the southern part of our region, you know, from Colorado over to Indiana there and Kentucky, was in the middle of the road, and we still see some drought problems over in that region. For the last 3 months, last three full months, October or August to October, you see a consistency, but an even more extreme on the warm side. This whole region was on the above average side, with a few states ranking in the top 10. Colorado would be number 10, and then Minnesota being in the top 5 there, and Wisconsin also ranking in the top 10 for that time period. You remember back, we had some warm stretches in August and the first part of September, and then some consistently warm temperatures, like we mentioned, all the way into October. So that end of October cold event really was the first significant cold that we experienced this fall. From a precipitation standpoint, for the 3 months, the plains area, we're voting as a whole block there, being above average to well above average, with Wyoming at 120 and South Dakota 123. Whereas Kansas and Iowa were on the opposite side, falling on the below average, and then the rest of the states fitting in somewhere in the middle average of the range. Okay, so that covers the last month and the last 3 months from a ranking scale. Did want to touch on something that, as we met with some of our partners yesterday, hitting on what has happened since the beginning of October, or since the beginning of November, excuse me. So we're only 2 weeks into the month, about halfway through, but noting that there has been astoundingly little precipitation across the region during the first part of November. This is a dot plot. I didn't use a contour plot because there was a bad data point up in Minnesota. It was throwing the contouring all off. So upper left-hand side is total precipitation. Excuse me, and I hid the scale, unfortunately. I should flip that around. But most of these numbers are on the below a ½ inch, and in some cases below a 1/10 of an inch of precipitation during November. On the lower right-hand side, where is that in the percent of normal? And you see that the dark brown is either 5% or 2% of normal, very, very low. And the only areas really getting closer to average in the way of precipitation, Arrowhead of Minnesota, parts of or the upper peninsula of Michigan, a little bit of Wisconsin, and some of the lower peninsula of Michigan. Now, a reminder, the beginning of November is not a big precipitation time, but when we're dealing with the drought issues we are in some places, even dry periods then become noticeable because they add to the conditions. So that is adding to our limiting our drought improvement and seeing some worsening in some places as we go along. So not a lot of issues or specific events in the last month. As again, we talked to people yesterday, it's been relatively quiet, not a lot of severe weather. The main thing was the cold event that occurred at the end of October and the associated precipitation and snow that came along with that. A picture from the Minnesota DNR State Climatology Office of some snow near Como Park that happened around Halloween, though they did remark that while it did make an unpleasant Halloween, it did not come anywhere near close to the 1991 Halloween, which is one of the more astounding Halloweens on record, with major snow in parts of the upper Midwest and ice along with that. So just a few pieces of information for that end of October time period on the way of temperatures and precipitation. Upper left-hand side is from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center. These are record highs for the 22nd to the 31st of November, so lots of record highs. And the black boxes are both high maximum and minimum temperatures, quite warm for that time of year. Throughout much of the Missouri up to Michigan area. On the lower left-hand side, these are the low temperature records showing the flip that occurred that we had 3 days, the 30th, 31st of October and the 1st of November, where we had record low temperatures set throughout most of the region. Again, the black boxes with low minimums and maximums. They don't line up quite as well, but then that showed you how big a shift we had from near record, lots of record high temperatures to record low temperatures in a very quick period. And then there was some precipitation, especially some snow. This is from the Twin Cities office, National Weather Service office, showing 6 to 8 inches of snow up in the far northern Minnesota, and then less in some of the other areas around that. One other specific event. And Doug, you might mute so I don't hear you typing, by the way.
Yeah, that's not good.
One other point that came to us from our Great Lakes folks, noting this is not over the last month, but a seasonal issue. The HABs, the Lake Erie, I'm drawing a blank on what HABs, the acronym stands for, that this was one of the not most severe, but on the moderately severe side. There is a scale, SI. There was a 5.3, which counts as moderately severe. The one this year, the HABs outbreak, was the second earliest start date, which was July 4th since 2002. Some cooler temperatures in September and some winds helped to break it up a little bit and not be quite as severe. And then that continued into October.
Harmful algal blooms, Dennis.
Harmful algal blooms. Thank you very much, Doug. I appreciate that. And then you can follow this link down here to find another whole publication that talked about that. Okay, probably the bigger issue in this whole situation are the hydrologic impacts that are from this year and from an ongoing perspective that really are the more serious thing that we need to be touching on in this. Not to do too much doom and gloom, but to bring home the point that we still have some water issues going on around us. So 7-day average stream flow here. that we have, and I think I didn't change the text on this from the last time. I apologize. So the brown areas are, the brown and red areas are where stream flow is low or much below average. So southeast Nebraska, Kansas into Iowa, and then parts of the eastern Corn Belt into the Ohio Valley and eastern Great Lakes are showing some below average stream flows that are because of these long-term precipitation deficits we'll talk about a bit more. Whereas Montana up in the Dakotas and parts of Wisconsin and Michigan are all, or have some places that are actually above average in the way of precipitation, above average in the way of stream flows for this time of year. Now, these may not be big stream flows, but this is typically a lower stream flow time of year. So the recent wetness has just helped that situation out. But these are pretty impressive and quite low stream flow values in some of these areas. Correspondingly, soil moisture follows along in some of those same areas. The upper left hand is a CPC NOAA product, a NASA product on the lower right hand side, and then the lower left hand side is USDA NASS, their weekly survey data, percent short and very short. So common things that we can see: Central Plains area into Iowa, parts of Missouri over to the eastern part of the Corn Belt. These are percentiles that are running fairly low for this time of year, and that is consistent with the product on the right-hand side. Whereas up in the Dakotas and to the northern plains, the recent precipitation has improved that situation and led to much better soil moisture in that area for this time of year, and that corresponds with what we're seeing in the USDA NASS, the state level reports. Just including this, it's still very early in the snow season from NRCS, highlighting the areas, these are the mountain snowpack areas, generally lower than average at this point. This would be, I believe, the Yellowstone in northern Wyoming, or this may be the Bighorn area, and have to have Patrick Erger chime in on that one or remind us of our geography. Otherwise, most other areas are below in the way of snowpack at this point. Not a major issue. We're still very early, so this is something we'll start to monitor as we can go along. Okay, what that leads to from a drought standpoint, kind of what you would expect. That area from Kansas, Nebraska into Iowa, parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin have carry-on drought issues for going for a longer period of time. Iowa, I believe this would be week number 178 of being D1 or more somewhere in the state. Longest stretch, I think Justin Glisson mentioned longest stretch since the 50s, though the drought monitor didn't exist in the 50s. That wet area in the northern plains, so no drought issues except for far along the Canadian border. And that dryness showing up in the eastern Corn Belt not being reflected yet on the drought monitor, but there have been some increases in that area over recent weeks and discussions from local folks about watching the dryness that's going on in that area. A little bit more of a zoomed in map over the same region, although the scaling kind of messes that up. And then where we have seen a change, and this is an 8-week change, looking over the last 2 months, what has happened on drought conditions on the drought monitor. So the areas in green and the darker green show multiple class improvements. The scale is on the right-hand side. So you see that area from northern Nebraska around to Wisconsin and Illinois, we've seen improvement, while we've seen some worsening in northwest Missouri, Kansas, parts of southeast Iowa, and then down along the Ohio River area. Again, much worsening in the southeastern part of the U.S., but usually not one of our areas here that we talk about. So rains have improved the situation overall, though we still have those lingering drought issues and some increasingly severe drought issues as we're going along. Touching on ag impacts, again, we are near the end of our growing season, so harvest is wrapping up, but there are still some ongoing ag issues that we can touch on here. Winter wheat progress. Generally, winter wheat is in pretty good shape. Upper left-hand side is percent of winter wheat that has emerged, and then the lower right-hand side is the conditions that are poor to very poor. So Kansas and Nebraska are ones that have a bit more of a poor to very poor wheat conditions. Most other states generally in pretty good conditions overall. We did have some concerns about winter wheat and cover crop seeding or any other winter grain seeding with the dryness going into the fall. There has been sufficient precipitation to at least wet the surfaces enough, and the warmth has helped establish these in fairly good conditions. From our standard row crops on the left-hand side, corn and soybeans, where we are as of Sunday, nationally, corn progress is 88%, with most of the central part of the Corn Belt nearly completed by now. The only slightly behind areas are in the Northern Plains, and then a decent amount in the Eastern Corn Belt where they've had delayed development and slower progress. A report from Indiana, Northern Indiana, was noting that from Austin Pearson that corn was still not drying in the field sufficiently and was coming off too wet, so that was delaying some of the corn harvest in that area. Soybean harvest is closer to being done, still a little bit of left in the Eastern Corn Belt, but we've moved ahead mostly on that. Sorghum, 92% nationally, and sunflower, 68% nationally, but those will continue working their way as we go along here. So again, harvest mostly completed with some delays in the eastern part of the Corn Belt. Winter wheat generally good. I mentioned the fall crop establishment. The other thing on the ag side is some pasture and grass availability concerns. We heard this from Zach Leeser in Missouri, and I've heard pieces of this in Iowa, that despite recent improvement, that really has not helped grass regrowth at this point. So availability of forage and grasses is something we are being concerned about. Oddly enough, in some of our western areas, there's been mention that people had actually reduced some cattle numbers, and there was enough rainfall this summer that grass grew actually quite well in some areas. Kind of a different thing than we have seen recently. Fire, unfortunately, has resurged, mostly in the state of Kentucky. If you've been hearing too much, we do have burn bans in Illinois, Indiana, maybe some in Ohio too. Didn't hear specifically, but Kentucky is the place where we've seen the worst issue so far. As of November 13th, 20,800 acres were currently burning, with 7,600 acres burned that were contained. So not monstrous, but enough that there's to be concerned about. And the oranges are county burn bans that were in Kentucky. Again, we heard the same things from some adjacent states with trying to stay ahead of the problem we're there. And then the other thing that came up in several different places and is something that really does have us concerned is that we have a number of municipalities in Iowa, Illinois, and probably some other places too, where we're getting into urban water supply problems. The big one right now is Osceola, Iowa, town of less than 10,000 people, I believe, but they have reached a point where they have 200 days of water supply left because of their reservoir. There's a casino with a floating casino on that reservoir. Not a major issue, but they're having problems with access to the casino right now. And we did note from Trent Ford in Illinois, about a lack of recovery in groundwater, and this really could lead to some problems of carryover into 2024, because wintertime is usually not a time we get a lot of precipitation to recover in the situation here. And just noting, if we go back 3 years, I mentioned over 3 years of D1 in Iowa, this is the precipitation departures we're dealing with over that 3-year period. 16 to 20 inches or more in that the Kansas to Iowa, Wisconsin area. Some other areas not too bad, but this is something that people should be monitoring and working with and looking ahead to if we should continue our situation, because we don't expect with the El Nino that there would be widespread major precipitation that would fix the situation. The other place that this is showing up is ultimately the Mississippi River, the main stem Mississippi River, but there are issues connected to other rivers. On the left-hand side, the Mississippi River is low already. There have been dredging operations occurring in the southern areas of the Mississippi River to keep to keep navigation open. We didn't talk about that directly, but we have low flow problems so far south of the Ohio River, but we're expecting that to increase because what's going to happen is the Missouri River is going to go through their usual aspect of reducing their flows from around 35,000 on down to around 15,000 by the beginning of December. That is a usual thing they do from a flow standpoint. But that reduction of around 20,000 cubic feet per second is actually a fairly significant number on the Mississippi River. And we're expecting to possibly see a few feet reduction because of that. And that's what's kind of modeled on the right-hand side here, simulating expected rainfalls and that reduction of inflow from the Mississippi River from where we are right now, which is the red line, and seeing a drop off of possibly several feet as we go along into December, which is going to add to our already problematic issues. Thanks to Anna Wolverton for the contribution as part of that. And in the Ohio River, that's the other part of the issue we're dealing with, is that the Ohio is actually a larger contributor south of where they come together with the Mississippi. It's running lower at this point. On the other hand, it is expected to recover some. This is a spaghetti plot of an ensemble, different ensembles of what is likely to happen between now and the end of December. The red line is the median on here. Basically, that we're expecting more flow from the Ohio to be happening by the end of December. Not a complete fix for everything, but will help us recover some of the situation. So again, a reminder what that's going to lead to. That's a reduced shipping capability, either slower getting out or not being able to fill barges as much. If we had this problem, getting fertilizers in the spring could be a problem. That's it's more costly, so it's a profitability loss in grains. There is some cruise activity. I don't know if that continues into the winter, but that was a problem last year, and that's causing the Army Corps of Engineers to continue dredging. And there was a comment this week that the dredging is going to have to move further north towards the St. Louis area to catch up with some of the problems. So the short answer, these low flow problems are likely going to stick with us into the winter and could be a problem going on into next year. Okay, one last thing to mention, completely unrelated to current conditions. Found out yesterday there's been released the new plant hardiness zone map. This is a USDA ag research product, my home organization. So this is updated from the 2012 one, just came out this week. The link is down there at the bottom, and there have been some shifts. Unfortunately, they didn't provide a shift from 2012 into this one, so we're going to be looking into that. But it does allow you to pick out a location and give you what the hardiness zones are for your location, and you can zoom in on it and zoom out on it. So I encourage you to go ahead and have a look at that. So that concludes my part of it, and just a reminder of how to get in touch with me. I'm going to turn it back over to Doug here, so he can grab control of it and go ahead with the Outlook part of it. Picture here is from what is the town in Colorado? Paxton, Colorado, shared by Patrick Erger of what's just some early snows out in that area. So take it away, Doug.
What screen do you see, please? Dennis?
I'm muted. Preview.
Oh.
So full screen it. Full screen it.
Okay, thank you. All right.
There you go.
Is that okay?
That's it.
All right. Thanks, Dennis, for all the information. There's a lot more sort of in-depth, no pun intended, on the soils and the memory and the system that we could have gotten into in terms of why the Mississippi is so low. You can see by the map that Dennis presented in the deficit in inches of rain over 2 or 3 years really does matter over a long period of time when it comes to what we call base flow in a lot of those rivers and such. Boy, I hope I don't lose my voice. Okay, so I'm going to give a little briefing about a little bit about El Nino and some of the typical things that happen during El Nino. Maybe all of you know that already or read the little briefings that we sent out a week or two ago, but I'll do that again. These are pictures, two of them I took, one on the left, far right. The one in the middle comes from Montana. I'm not going to say where exactly, but we'll say somewhere in Helena to protect the innocent. That was their snowstorm. I guess we'll call it around Halloween or just before, I think, is when the cold air came down and they got a good snow. The image on the left is from Kansas City. It's a sun pillar, and the one on the right is, as you may know, a rainbow in Montana. So on we go. Sorry to bludgeon you over the head with all this writing, but I kind of wanted to get it up front. And as Dennis said, the region as a whole, you could describe it as broadly dry. We've seen that over the last few falls, as a matter of fact, and summers to some degree. And in this case, or in this year, it was a spring that was incredibly dry over an odd part of the country, and actually very wet up against the mountains to our west in the high plains. It was really a backwards year in terms of typicalness in terms of precipitation. Fall and winter, as we say, almost what we said the last 2 or 3 years, is a major recharge part of our seasons so that we can build up that soil moisture before freeze up happens. So as soon as the ground freezes, it's harder for liquid water to kind of infiltrate down where we really need it in those late summer months and into the fall, and for base flow and everything else. So thus, soils are thirsty. We've had 3 to 4 years of drought in many areas, off and on sometimes. It is a relatively dry time of year, not including the higher elevations to our west. They get a lot of snow and actually a lot of inches of precipitation during that time. We are in a quote unquote strong El Nino, and that is noted by being 1.5 degrees Celsius above normal in a portion of the equator, along the equator in the eastern Pacific. And the question always is, does that help? Does that help anything? Does it help the dryness? What does it do? We'll get into that a little bit more, and it really does depend upon where you are in our region, or where you are in the U.S. if you don't happen to be from our north central part of the U.S. Excuse me. Less likely to help in the Ohio Basin, sort of north and eastern Midwest, Great Lakes area, and the upper Missouri Basin, based upon what's happened in past El Ninos. Better chances of wet sort of in the central and sort of coming up from the south, central and southern plains. And we'll see that more materialize as we get into winter and early spring. How much precipitation is the other question we often get, is to end the drought. And that, of course, is very place-based. But in general, what we need are some long-lasting, broad rain and snow events across the region. Some recovery is always possible during this time of year, but we don't want to put all the pressure, if you will, on spring to get the moisture that we need. So if we had a spring like last year and we were dry all the way up till that point, we'd be in big trouble. Here's a typical, and whatever that means, typical in terms of, I don't want to say normal, but often an El Nino pattern looks like this across the U.S., where we have warmer than normal conditions to the north, drier conditions showing up in the Ohio Valley, sort of eastern Midwest. That actually can extend a little bit to the north there, and all the way to the northwest sometimes, those drier conditions, especially in the mountains. And then wetter and cooler to the south, kind of the opposite of La Nina. Here is a couple graphics that, if you look at the frequency on the left, frequency of temperature being above or below normal during an El Nino. There's 29 El Ninos since we started counting. I think it's 1950 or so total. And out of those, how many have been one way or the other? And this is showing you the darker the reds or the darker the blues, the frequency is higher that we will experience either warmer than normal conditions or cooler than normal conditions. So if you look to the north, you look at Montana, You look sort of, yeah, along that from the Great Lakes to Washington, the state of Washington, you'll see that there's a tendency of more often warmer than normal, just like we just showed in that graphic before this. If you look to the south, especially along the southern border to the East Coast, you'll see that there's a tendency for cooler than normal. Doesn't mean the north is going to be warmer than the south. It simply means that compared to what they normally experience, it's going to be one way or the other a little bit. On the right hand, you can see the map of precipitation frequency. Okay, so the frequency of it being drier, brown, or wetter, green, goes up a little bit, and as you might suspect, precipitation is more fickle generally than temperature when it comes to averages here. So you do see the Rockies, and you do see the northern Rockies having a higher frequency of dryness, as well as the Great Lakes down in the Ohio Valley. In between the two, there's kind of flip-floppiness, and there's and sort of vague indications that Nebraska south and southwest a little bit are going to be wetter or have a higher frequency of wetter conditions during an average El Nino. And these are blended, strong, medium. We have strong, moderate, and sort of weak El Ninos. This is kind of blending them all together. So it doesn't tell you the whole story. One of the problems is we don't have enough El Ninos to do good statistics on it. But this is what we have so far. So the other question we often get is, what does El Nino mean for my snow where I live? So again, when you blend all El Ninos together from, in this case, 1959 to 2023 versus an average the last 30 years, 1991 to 2020, this is where you see snowfall deficits and increases. So notice the Great Lakes and portions of the Northeast U.S., actually from Minnesota east and from sort of eastern Montana west, you see a deficit of snowfall. I'm looking at the left-hand image there. The one on the right, that's all El Ninos. If you just look at the sort of moderate to stronger El Ninos, you get a slightly different pattern, but generally it's the same thing. The stronger the El Nino, the more confidence we have in our forecasts. I won't necessarily say it'll be the impact will be any stronger, but the forecast will be more likely to come true. So anyway, we're in a strong El Nino, just to repeat. And this, by the way, is January through March snowfall patterns. Now, the other thing we have to consider when we look at all this stuff is what is going on anyway with snowfall across the country. Forget the fact that we have El Ninos, La Ninas, and neutrals. What is just going on? And here we see, if you just try to track from 1959 to now, changes in snowfall in inches per decade for every 10 years. And we see an increase in portions of the of Great Lakes, more snowfall. But we also see a tendency in the lower 48 to have less snowfall overall anyway. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Now, the images that I showed you before this, those two, they have been, if you will, this is kind of getting a little technical, but they've been detrended already. So without trend, if you take that out of the picture, this is what happens with El Ninos. This is what's happening, generally speaking, no matter what year it is. All right. All right. This is another image. Some other research was done, but looking at December, January, and February, so our core winter months, what is is there any increase or decrease of extremes? That's what this is looking at. So we do see an increased chance for temperature extremes being much above normal for the northern tier, like we just said, and a slight or less coverage, I guess you could say, of extremes for the south, in portions of the south, mainly southwest, so southwestern U.S. On the precipitation side, we see for, again, December through February, our precipitation chances, risk of dryness is much higher in Montana and in Wyoming, where we sort of think it should be with an El Nino, strong or moderate El Nino. and then there's some other bits around the Ohio Valley and such. But notice the green or the dark green, basically from Nebraska south and a little bit to the southwest, but then all the way along the Gulf Coast. Good chances, better chances for wetness again. Just more images to kind of throw at you to kind of give you an idea of what El Nino is trying to tell us. How about that? Here's the forecast. I know this is a bit weird, but down here at the bottom, you see OND stands for October, November, December, and then November. These are 3 months indicators for each of these bars. Basically, it's saying El Nino is going to continue well into February, March, April, and then sort of decline in the we'll say early to late, well, through the springtime, and then some indication that neutral conditions will come back late spring into summer. That's sort of where we are right now in terms of our prediction. El Ninos this strong tend to die off quickly, and they tend to tail off pretty quickly. Now to the forecasts and outlooks. Excuse me. This is the total precipitation for the next 7 days over the U.S. You'll notice this, and it's not. I'm not going to claim that the reason it's going to rain in Nebraska and in eastern Kansas is because of El Nino. I'm not saying that. However, it just coincidentally does show up there that there's a kind of bullseye, if you will, over that region. Some general snows, higher elevation, and light precipitation off to our west. Some substantial rains across the Ohio Valley. We really hope that happens. But really, this area of dryness in some of these areas, especially Iowa, not really showing much in terms of precipitation over the next 7 days, accumulation over that time. So on we go. Just wanted to show this. Came out yesterday afternoon. There's a slight risk, which is less than 20% or 20% or so, risk of heavier snows in the high plains, basically. Colorado to Montana. Again, this would be next week, not this week, not in the next 7 days, but beyond that. Okay. Now, the week 2 forecast, again, we're looking at November 23rd to the 29th. This will be updated today and probably in the next hour or two. But this was yesterday, 23rd to the 29th. Again, you see that above normal on the right. If you see that above normal, slightly above normal signature up there for the high plains, that's probably the same thing as indicating from that heavy snow potential. But, so watch the weather if you're traveling. Below normal in terms of precipitation, again, the right graphic for a wide swath of the northeast into the Midwest and sort of near normal-ish in between the two. Below normal temperatures pretty much prevailing next week, next 7 days. I'm sorry, week 2, the 23rd to the 29th through the end of November. We'll say it that way. It's probably the best way to say that. Looking at December, the month of December, we're looking at kind of a split, equal chances of below, above, or near normal in the western, if you will, half of the north central part of the U.S., but well above, better chances for above normal temperatures, especially around the Great Lakes and Midwest. In terms of precipitation, there is this above normal signature across Nebraska. It's kind of a bullseye there. Dennis, for the life of me, I cannot remember why that's there. We can discuss that later unless you want to chime in. See? Dennis is afraid to chime in. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't recall. There was some of the products they look at that showed something there. It was not strong. It was not strong, but they went ahead and included it. So. Yeah.
So if you'd say, "Hey, Doug, is this an El Nino pattern?" I'd say maybe, and the only reason I'd say maybe is because I'd look at the southeast and see all that above normal, higher, better percentages of above normal precipitation down there, and I'd say that's pretty indicative of an El Nino. And then, a little bit above in Nebraska to the south. Yeah, sure. And the below normal up to the north. Yep, that too. The temperature is a little bit off, but what 1 month doesn't make, if you will, a season. So we're going to have to, here's the seasonal. And so you can see it's a lot different than the 1 month, by the way. So there's the 1 month, there's the 3 month outlook. So temperature on the left, this is a very El Nino signature here in terms of temperature outlook, with warmth to the north or above, better chances of above normal to the north through our core winter months. That's an El Nino signature right there. Same for Alaska if anybody's traveling up there. Precipitation wise, pretty close to what we would think would be typical for an El Nino. I hope we're wrong in some cases there. We obviously need a good snowpack in the mountains in the northern Rockies, but other parts of the U.S. will benefit in some ways too, especially in the southeast where it's been so bone dry for so long. Not a great pattern, if you will, for the Mississippi River overall, but yeah. And then if we move ahead a couple months and look at the February into early spring months, we see a similar pattern where we see above normal temperatures continuing more or less across the northern part of, or better chances for above normal temperatures across the northern part of the U.S. And precipitation-wise, to a lesser extent, below normal precipitation in the lakes and in the Northwest. And that tongue, if you will, of moisture sort of coming up out of the Gulf of Mexico towards the Central Plains, Southern Plains, and Central Plains. We're crossing our fingers on that kind of thing to happen. Okay, let's see. The drought outlook through February shows this, and the quick description is the brown areas are where the forecasters don't believe drought is going to get substantially better. And this is through the end of February, by the way. And this is our drier time of year in most of these places, by the way. So it's hard to alleviate drought when not a lot of precipitation normally falls anyway. In some of the green areas or gray shaded areas, there is some thought that those areas will either improve or completely lose their drought signature. So notice the continued dry north and Midwest and some wetting across Kansas and southern plains. Again, my key points here are we're under an El Nino advisory, and it's a strong El Nino, so our confidence is a little higher, which probably means we're going to be really wrong. But anyway, dryness continues across much of the north central U.S., as I said earlier. Short term, relatively warm to average, but mostly dry. Except for those places, except for like Kentucky and portions of Kansas, Nebraska. Temperatures cooler than normal. Week 2, relatively dry again to near average, except for the northern high plains, which would probably be snow if it did fall in days 8 through 14, if you will. Long term, monthly to seasonal, pretty much a classic El Nino pattern is what is predicted. Enhanced chances for above normal temperatures to the north, enhanced likelihood of drier than normal conditions from Montana to the Great Lakes.
Hey, Doug?
Yes.
Doug?
Yeah.
Are you on your wrap-up slide?
I'm on key points. Did not go?
It's not showing up that way. I'm still seeing the December outlook here.
December. Wow.
Yeah.
You're way back here?
Okay. It must have been an issue on my end. I apologize. Everything must be okay otherwise.
Okay. Well, hey, chime in if I'm wrong there. El Nino to ebb away and transition to neutral conditions by late spring into early summer. It will take some time for the atmosphere to reflect those changes. And then finally, there's some contact information for Dennis and I, and there the weather.gov, climate.gov, heat.gov. Those are all government websites you may find interest in. We will be able to find the past recording of this if anybody's so crazy to actually want to listen to us again. here at Purdue and at the High Plains Regional Climate Center, Nebraska. And then I also wanted to point out that 2 days ago, the 5th National Climate Assessment came out. There's many chapters in here. There's geographic chapters like Midwest, Northern Great Plains, and many other chapters when it comes to different sectors like agriculture and built environments and things like that. So I can't go into a great description about that. There will be webinars. There will be face-to-face meetings. If you have any questions about those, both Dennis and I were part of that. If you have questions for us, let us know. We can usually find somebody who can help you if we can't. So I'm going to, well, yeah, I guess I'm going to do that for a moment. You're still looking at my slideshow, right?
I glitched a few minutes ago. It must have been a problem on my end, and your slides are not up refreshing for me, unfortunately. So hopefully it'll work for everyone else.
Okay. Well, Molly said it worked for her, so.
Okay, good.
We do have some questions, and I know, Dennis, you can see those. Harmful algal blooms is important. Somebody asked a question about, yeah, thank you. And somebody asked a question about the southern part of the U.S., Southern Plains, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, December into February, and what this means for them. And I think I've described that pretty well in terms of typically cooler and wetter conditions are more likely, which is, I'm sure, good news. But it's not a guarantee, and that's something we need to caveat right here and now, is that just the fact that we have images of above normal forecasts out there in terms of temperature for a 3-month period doesn't mean that whole 3 months is going to be above normal. In fact, we expect a couple Arctic plunges, kind of like what we had in October, being a lot colder than we'd normally like it. But when you average the 3 months out, and this is the tricky part, when you average the 3 months out, the prediction is that when you do that, we'll be above normal in terms of temperature. And same thing with precipitation. When you average those 3 months out, so we may have a bone dry December or a really wet December. How about a really wet December where we think it's going to be dry, and then January, February turns off, and it averages out below normal. So in a way, that's a good forecast. We'll see.
The last question kind of goes along with that one too, was taking note of the, why the eastern U.S. and the southern U.S. were wetter while there's drier was expected in the northern plains. So kind of related to that same thing, the subtropical jet that across the southern U.S. is more pronounced and leads to more precipitation, and less of that moisture is available up in the northern plains. Yeah,
the jet stream, so in a typical El Nino year, one jet stream, sometimes a subtropical jet stream is called, does bring a lot of moisture in clouds and everything else to the southern part of the U.S. And there's actually a split flow, what we call split flow across the U.S., where another piece of the jet stream sort of bottles up the really cold air to the north. I read some article, and it was on a NOAA blog post yesterday, about the late winter, early spring frequency of what do we call those things? Vortex, polar vortexes being more common during an El Nino. So I'm not predicting that, by the way, but there's some indication that they can happen more often in February, maybe even in March, at the end of kind of in the late winter time frame. Why does the map with decreasing snowpack only go to 1959? Well, yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, and I tried to address it, that you mentioned earlier that the number of counted El Ninos we do since 1950, because that's when the more modern way of classifying El Ninos compared to how we used to count them using the Southern Oscillation Index started. So we start those in 1950, but why that the El Nino and the snow trend starts in 59 in that data set, I find interesting. I assume it has to do with when that data set was established and starts, but I find it that's kind of an odd one I couldn't explain.
Yeah, agreed. And let me see. Oh, there you go. We can go and look those things up maybe on that. I put the URL at the bottom of this page. Hopefully you can see that. Can you see that? Maybe Dennis can't see that. But anyway, I guess I can put it in. I'm going to answer the question this way too. It'd be good if you want to know the answer to that question, read the article that came from, and I'll put it down here. There. Yeah. That should tell us why. Oh, will the increased precipitation in the mountainous areas translate into increased spring water supplies? Well, it depends on which mountainous areas I guess we're talking about. Because in the outlook really is for below normal precipitation in the mountains from, let's say, northern Colorado to Canada, so the northern Rockies. But other areas across California, yeah, that typically it would. And I guess the southwestern U.S. But the outlook isn't really for that area to get that wet, if you will. So the Southwest, that is. There's a chance, they're slight, but it's not strong. Dennis, anything else you want to say about this long-term dryness across the Midwest and some of the impacts, or other than the Mississippi River?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we shouldn't take lightly. You know, if you're in an area where the water supply is trying to be questionable from a quantity standpoint, or even if not, it's probably worthwhile to start having that conversation about what if this gets worse, so that we're not in that same kind of situation that the town of Osceola is in. I know there have been some regional discussions. Some of the states are starting discussions, and I think that is a very valuable thing to do, to learn from what other places are doing, to discuss what could be done as alternatives and what our options are, and, you know, if necessary, to start watering restrictions sooner, water use restrictions sooner rather than later, so we can stretch water supply if this should continue.
Okay. All right. I think we're going to wrap it up here. Our next, I promise that in December, I know it's right before Christmas, it's the 21st, but that this next speaker is going to be somewhat better than Dennis and I put together. So on that note, I'll say thank you so much for coming and asking questions, and we'll see you next month. So thank you.